Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. This month, across socialprotection.org, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the platform. We are 10 years old, and in this episode, we're looking back on social protection over the past decade. Casting our minds back to the distant past of 2015, we'll talk about social protection making its appearance in the SDGs, the COVID era and its legacy, and how we're talking now about social protection in relation to gender equality, climate change and conflict. And we'll look ahead to what the next chapter might bring. It's an ambitious survey, so let's get right to it. With me today, I have three fantastic guests, all of whom have appeared on past blockbuster episodes. Fabio Vera Soares is a researcher at the International Policy Centre for Inclusive Development at the Institute of Applied Economic Research. Edward Archibald is an independent consultant in social protection and a PhD student at Oxford University. And Zara Rizvi is social policy specialist at UNICEF. Welcome, Fabio, Ed, and Zara.
Thank you for having me, Jo.
Thanks, Jo. Good to be with you again.
Thanks, Jo. And I love that I'm on this podcast with both Fabio and Ed. It's great to be here.
Thank you all, and absolutely wonderful to welcome you all back. Fabio, let's start with you, and let's start by going back in time a decade or so. 2015 marked the end of the period covered by the Millennium Development Goals, remember those, and saw the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, although of course the SDGs had already been around for a few years. Back then, how was social protection being discussed in international fora?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that the first thing to point out is that even though the SDGs were launched in 2015, the discussions around them started well before. And I think that they were actually shaped by the 2008 global financial crisis and how middle-income countries have responded to the crisis and how the global attention of that response influenced several processes within multilateral institutions, organizations, and fora. And then I would highlight, first of all, how the G20, for example, changed the way it was organized. It existed since 1997. And then it was mostly like the head of the central banks and the Minister of Finance getting together to try to coordinate actions to avoid financial instability, to avoid crisis. But 2008 was pretty different because it was not only a financial crisis. If you remember, we also had the fuel crisis, and particularly for what we want to discuss here, we had the food crisis. So what was happening in many developing countries with the food inflation made the UN and also multilateral fora like the G20 to try to respond in a more coherent way and using different instruments. And it started changing a little bit the discourse. So if we remember, basically, we're discussing at the time social safety nets. That was the expression that was mostly used. And then we started talking about social protection. So in parallel to the discussions in the G20, we also had within the UN system the Social Protection Floor Initiative that's actually started in 2009, so well before the adoption of the Social Protection Floor recommendation by ILO. And I would say that developing countries like Brazil have used these instruments to stabilize the macroeconomy, but also to avoid huge increase in poverty rates and inequality. So I think that was the environment in which we saw social protection coming out as one of the key instruments for SDG 1, for eradication of poverty, and as a specific indicator that needed to be tracked, and that the UN system as a whole and international cooperation should be supporting developing countries, and in particular low-income countries, to implement not as a safety net, but as a social protection system.
Thank you, Fabio. I could come to no one else for such a succinct overview of that period. And just quickly to stay with you, Fabio, as a follow-up, this episode is celebrating the 10th anniversary of the socialprotection.org platform. How and why was socialprotection.org established at that time?
Yeah, the socialprotection.org was actually a recommendation from the development working group of the G20. The development working group was created in 2010, but it was sort of mandated in 2009. And basically, that's when the G20 starts looking not only at the financial issues, at macroeconomic stabilization and coordination, but also at development issues. So there, the largest economies of the world would also try to coordinate their action, not only for the development of all their own economies, but also for the global development. So there, as I mentioned to you, social protection becomes something that the G20 was looking at, and it was considered one of the key actions of one of the pillars of the multi-year plan of the developing working group. And that pillar was the growth with resilience. So building social protection systems was seen as a key action that G20 countries should take, but perhaps most important, should help developing countries and low-income countries to act on, to establish systems, and to establish these systems looking not at the North, but looking at how middle-income countries had replied to the crisis and how they have established more comprehensive systems that helped them to tackle the crisis. It's in that context that there was this key recommendation coming out from the 2011 DWG during the French presidency that basically called upon the international organizations to try to build, at the time they would say not platform, they would say the language was gateway, a social protection gateway to support low-income countries to establish social protection systems. The platform was first hosted in a partnership between the UN system through UNDP and the Brazilian government here in Brazil. The idea is that we had middle-income countries with a social protection system relatively mature that use it to respond to the crisis, and that could be a good frame and a good start point to start sharing knowledge and to have an initiative like that to support developing countries and low-income countries.
And thus socialprotection.org was born. Ed, we once ran an episode on how social protection could contribute or does contribute to just about all of the SDGs. But as Fabio was just saying, it is most explicitly referenced against SDG 1, which is about eliminating extreme poverty, including through the extension of social protection for all. What does that tell us about how social protection was seen as contributing to sustainable development at the time that the SDGs were being prepared?
Thanks, Joe, for the question. By 2015, there were quite a few international actors working on social protection, particularly UN agencies, some bilateral donors, the World Bank, and others. And there was variation in how those different actors have advocated for social protection. And thinking about it from a multidimensional perspective, thinking across a number of SDGs, I've always found there's an inherent challenge for practitioners working on and advocating for sectors. On the one hand, practitioners might say, look at my sector, it can contribute to all these different global goals, but the risk of that approach is that your sector is seen as being a bit of a jack of all trades and master of none. It makes a useful contribution to many development objectives, but it doesn't deliver the knockout blow. So going back to where the G20 was positioning it, it actually makes sense from one perspective that social protection is primarily linked to SDG 1. But that's also fraught, right? And there are lots of impact evaluations that show higher income for beneficiaries while they're part of the program. And of course, that's what an evaluation would show because beneficiaries are being given cash every month or two. And this links to a core gripe of mine, which is that social protection, in particular social cash transfers, have often been pitched by implementers or perceived by decision makers as a silver bullet. And it's not a silver bullet. It's one tool in the policy shed. So I worry about governments or donors thinking that poverty can be reduced sustainably by someone being on a social cash transfer program for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I wonder sometimes whether impact evaluations have unwittingly contributed because, sustainable poverty reduction just from receiving cash transfers for a few years is extraordinarily unlikely scenario in countries with poor governance, limited infrastructure, weak public services, let alone those that suffer from climate events or conflict. Certainly the political economy of social cash transfers in sub-Saharan Africa, where I work, quite a bit, means the governments still don't fund the majority of their cash transfer programs from domestic revenue. And I exclude the World Bank programs from that assessment because I don't see highly concessional 30-year loans or grants as having the same value to a government as domestic revenue. Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about the SDGs and how it's been positioned and whether things might have evolved differently over the last decade.
Yeah, interesting, because I think, obviously the thrust of SDG 1, or at least the social protection part of it, and also the idea of social protection floors, and as Fabio was saying, it's all about building them as parts of government systems that can provide support over sustained periods. But I appreciate that, especially in low-income or fragile and conflict-affected states, that's where we might find systems that are perhaps more project-driven, not yet enshrined into law or sustained by national budgets.
And I guess a lot of my experience is sort of at the low middle income perspective and where things play out there. And yeah, a lot of well-intentioned ideas that, in my view, haven't gained the traction. The momentum hasn't been there.
Zara, only 5 years on from 2015, it's now 2020, and the world is in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw an unprecedented effort in many countries to introduce or expand social protection programs and cash transfers and other instruments of different kinds to help people respond to the economic and employment shocks created by stay-at-home orders, border closures, disrupting industries, and economic downturn. What do you remember from that time about the sudden international focus on social protection, the elevation of these sets of instruments, and the response from our sector?
There is so much to remember from that time of COVID. I mean, I don't really even know where to start. I come from the humanitarian side, right? And I was working for the SPIAC-B working group on linking social protection and cash. I was a consultant at the time. And I remember the first webinar that I'd ever done and ever facilitated was with socialprotection.org. And that was brilliant. And that was in December of 2019, actually. So this is pre-COVID. And we were talking about and trying to convince a group of people and really trying everybody to get to this webinar where we were like, guys, you can link social protection and humanitarian cash. It's something you can actually do. COVID happens and we go from being super niche, from being like center stage. People couldn't move. They couldn't actually get to the front lines of this pandemic. And you had governments that were responding like crazy. And it was something that, everybody was like, oh, it's not something like we were seen as dreamers, where we were just like, but a social protection system can respond in an emergency. And everybody was like, no, they can't. And all of a sudden, here it was. Governments were responding, left, right, and center. It was incredible what was going on. And for me, the big takeaway from that COVID time was political will. If it's there, you can make it happen. And I remember one of the lines that we kept saying over and over and over again was, none of these are actually technical problems. And it was amazing how quickly those technical problems started falling to the side. Like, oh, data and registration and how can we pay out, and such amazing creative things were coming up. Also how the technology and payment mechanisms itself and how quickly that started growing, how quickly we started doing digital delivery, etc. So that was really an incredible, the leaps and bounds that we saw on the side of governments actually being able to respond was breathtakingly beautiful. And I heard it from the humanitarian side of the house where they were like, well, governments are too slow. And I was like, well, that blew that out of the water, completely out of the water.
Ed, we're talking about a sudden surge there in a lot of countries responding using social protection systems. A lot of that was temporary, of course. What do you think has been the legacy, if you like, of the COVID crisis on the social protection sector, or how we think about social protection since then?
Look, I've got a few reflections on that. First, I think the quantity of responses during COVID often masked the quality of the responses. And the global totals of social protection responses to COVID, and I'm thinking maybe here about low middle income countries, which are the context where I've had experience. In some of the contexts where I was working, announcements were made, but domestic resources weren't allocated. Small transfer levels were spread widely across the electorate. And I use the electorate deliberately because these things were often done, I think, with a political eye. And on the donor side, sometimes the funds took months and months to appear. There's one country I worked on where they had to redo most of the enrollment process because the banking details collected during the rapid enumeration weren't adequate for the mobile money system to function. So lots of eligible households either never received transfers or received them months after they were due. My hope probably in 2020, 2021 was that COVID would see a much greater use of national systems by humanitarian actors over many years, over the longer term. But, I don't always see a lot of progress on that. And certainly there are good stories. I don't want to deny that. An example I'm working on at the moment, Carla Lacerda and I are working on a paper where we're trying to understand why international humanitarian actors have bypassed national social protection systems. We've been looking at Ukraine over the last 3 years. And what we find that there are some rules of the game, basically, that create strong incentives to circumvent national systems. So combined with domestic capacity limitations, and those certainly do exist, there are these entrenched incentives that create a path-dependent preference for parallel delivery mechanisms a lot of the time. And those undermine global commitments to localization, global commitments to system strengthening. That said, on the glass half full side of the COVID ledger, there was a lot of learning by doing by national officials. And in some cases, there's been a permanent shift away from less effective or less efficient delivery methods that might have existed or been used previously. So part of my PhD work is on Zambia, actually, and that my fieldwork there suggests the national government is never going to go back to wide-scale delivery of in-kind humanitarian aid through a parallel system. And why? Partly because the use of mobile money to deliver cash transfers during COVID demonstrated to decision makers that the social cash transfer system could mobilize rapidly and at national scale. That supports what Zara was saying as well. National governments could deliver. And last year, 2024, Zambia faced this huge drought, and the government delivered a national response, vertical expansions, horizontal expansions, through the social cash transfer system, leveraging that system. And I don't think that would have happened without the government's experiences and experiments in responding to COVID.
Fabio, what are your reflections on that COVID period?
I have just two observations. So we talk a lot COVID, but what I try to reflect a little bit on my first answer is that we already had social protection as the instrument to respond to a previous crisis. So it was not widespread. It was not like the global response that we saw during the COVID. But precisely the G20 recommendation at the time was that, wow, there are lessons from some countries, particularly these high middle income countries, that managed to surf the crisis and respond using these new instruments, right? So the conditional cash transfers, that it was like very fashionable at the time, but evolving to something else and stabilizing incomes for the poor and the vulnerable. So I would say that SPIACB and socialprotection.org are like sister initiatives that were initiated by the G20 based on this crisis response that we saw in the middle income countries. And during this process and through this exchange, I think that many low middle income countries and some low income countries started developing these systems, trying to learn from that experience. And to be fair here, I would like to highlight some of the innovations that were already happening in sub-Saharan Africa. So mobile payments was something that was much more common in the very first cash transfer programs that we saw in Africa than what we saw in Latin America. That was actually an innovation that fed back from Africa to Latin America. And I would say that the socialprotection.org at the time of the COVID was a great example of how the G20 has contributed actually to fight the crisis by enabling these so important instruments in which countries were sharing their experience there and learning from each other. So I think that was a major achievement.
I love what Fabio was just saying. And Fabio, I'm just going to change your words around a little bit and talking about COVID as like an equalizer, almost in a way. Countries that we don't normally look to for good examples, they had a real chance to flex. There was something really amazing about this. One of the best programs that I saw in the COVID response was actually Pakistan's, the SAS Fund. Pakistan has been working on their BISP, the BISP program, for such a long time. The way that they were able to just take it, move it, start getting the money out the door. Like, it's still one of the most incredible things. And for me, that's a real legacy of COVID, the equalizing or the equal opportunity of having a good social protection system. If you've got good governance in place, if you've got innovation investment.
Zara, another legacy of COVID, perhaps more broadly, was the spotlight that it shone on the care economy and who's doing all of the work of caring for children out of school in particular in that case. But this kind of gendered aspect around the care economy has become a really rich area for social protection. I think the other thing we've seen in recent years is a sort of a larger body of research around the impact of social protection on things like gender-based violence. So I'm interested to hear from you. How have you seen the thinking and evidence about the gendered dimensions of social protection and the opportunities for women's empowerment? How is that changing over time?
COVID really showed the centrality of care and support. It became super evident, but so did the gaps that we have in the policies and structures. The biggest example of this is women in unpaid work. Globally, that number is around like 70%. In some regions like MENA, South Asia, it goes up to like 80, 90%. And it's a ridiculous amount of work that never before was getting quantified in these ways, and really bringing attention to the fact that women are doing this unpaid work. Ed, you were actually saying before, in terms of cash transfers, were not the silver bullet that everybody thought it would be. I think that links so well into the care and support discussion as well. One of the things that UNICEF talks about a lot is Cash Plus. But it's those links to services. It's not just about cash. It's never just about the cash by itself. It is what is around that cash. What are the support systems that we are putting in that will support women? Childcare is a great example. And this is where, if we were able to just provide the childcare, it frees up women's time in such a massive way. And especially if you're doing informal work or even formal work, this is like, one of those huge sort of policy changes that we could be looking at that would have such a massive impact. Talking about conditional cash versus unconditional cash. With conditional cash, it is, again, normally the woman who has to go and do the conditionality that is attached to it. A lot of times it's around, health services or health checks, or, a kid has to go to school or whatever it might be, and those sorts of things. But if we just have unconditional, we know that household is lacking financial resources. Just make it unconditional cash and you are freeing up so much time and labor that gets involved in that. Basically, the major thing is, if we look at intentional design, the resourcing and cross-sectoral linkages, it becomes so much easier to look at good gender-responsive programming.
Fabio, are we starting to see pushback in some countries and international fora on gender equality? What do you think this means for our sector and the way we need to be thinking and working?
The thing that I would like to highlight is that there is always a bias when we speak about the recommendations and the action of a multilateral fora that focus on the economic side, on economic cooperation, even if they are talking about development. So, as I mentioned in my previous answer, social protection gets us into the G20 action as an economic stabilizer. So the discourse there has mostly been around women's empowerment, not necessarily a rights-based discourse. I would say that the G20 has progressively been much stronger on the women's economic empowerment. And a proof of that was actually the India G20 back in 2023. Where they have actually created a specific group, the Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group, with specific recommendations. And actually, in the Brisbane Declaration, so in the Australian presidency of the G20, they actually had a clear target on increasing women's labor force participation. So it links to social protection because then we need to have gender-sensitive social protection. Having said that, it's pretty clear now that many countries, at least in the discourse, they are not putting this agenda with the same emphasis that we would like to see, or actually they are reducing some of the space that the actors working in this sector have. And that also reflects in the multilateral forum and how the language is being used to try to avoid a more progressive policy decisions and policy cooperation around the gender agenda. So we still have the SDGs. I think the SDGs is a good platform for that. For the countries that haven't opted out, it's still the way that we can find the language and we can find the political will to try to move forward this agenda. Gender-sensitive social protection is a key instrument in order to force this agenda until the post-SDG era. That's another discussion that we need to start having now.
Something that's really stood out to me has been the growing interest in how social protection can contribute to climate adaptation, mitigation, and transition. And in our most recent episode, my guest from Cambodia, Shreng Sopon Likshamai, talked about how shock-responsive social protection policies and measures employed in response to COVID have now led, at least in the policy setting, to a greater focus on how to deploy those instruments to respond to disasters and climate-related shocks as well. Ed, what are you seeing here? Are we looking at a significant change in the way social protection systems are being designed and implemented? Or is it kind of really more of the same and we're just building the case for strengthening traditional systems to respond to the next generation of shocks?
In terms of climate change, I don't see a step change at a macro level, at a global level. But definitely the role of social protection with regard to climate change certainly has a bit more recognition than it did 5 years ago. There have been some developments. One aspect is in terms of the evidence base on practical things like anticipatory financing. There's a paper from a year or two ago that has the quantitative numbers on the cost effectiveness of giving cash transfers in Bangladesh a few days before a flood hits rather than a week or two after. Now, the evidence was positive. So the key challenge is surely about political will and about whether there's political support to build and maintain those systems. I think, similar to something Zara mentioned earlier. And in particular, I think on the donor financing side, where there are commonly different funding channels for humanitarian aid and social protection within the same donor. And those two channels, those two camps often don't plan together. They don't necessarily collaborate. So I think that there's a key obstacle there. I think it's because the full ramifications are still perhaps too far off for some decision makers. And if you think about the donor programming cycle, they're generally geared up for 4 or 5 year programming cycles at the most. So I see that as a disconnect, right, between where the full ramifications are and programming cycles. Experts say that climate change will contribute to migration, both within countries and across borders. But it's difficult enough for governments in low middle income countries to deal with poverty today, let alone trying to predict and prepare for internal or international migration trends in 2035 or 2040 or 2050. As you mentioned in your question, I think the best way forward is to keep strengthening traditional systems to respond to both acute and chronic needs.
I think, Ed, again, this is coming back to where we are sitting at any sort of given moment. My current job is very much, looking at all of this globally, etc. The countries that I'm thinking about, all in Central Asia, the East Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. They are super into the whole entire climate agenda. They are using their social protection systems. So when they are looking at system strengthening work, when they are looking at what is their pressing problem, and these are more high income countries. So therefore, they have the privilege to be able to look at these sorts of things, but they're on the front line. And, there's been some incredible work, actually, I think on the climate side and social protection side. I know in the Eastern Caribbean, a lot of work is being done. And of course, we've got, in Barbados, we've got Mia Mottley-Amore, who is, one of the biggest champions around this. So I think, again, we're going to come back to like the political will. Is it something that is pressing on people? So I think taking those examples and really starting to do pilots over there, but I think looking at good examples there and working with what's happening there can later on be there and ready to take to other countries as we may need to. There is actually a lot of good practice, I would say, around looking at climate and social protection, and we should absolutely be taking that into account.
I feel like on this topic, we're still very much in the realms of advocacy, and we're starting to see some more examples of countries that are explicitly, at least in instruments like the NDCs, thinking about social protection as a sector, or started to think, I guess, about the flow-through effects on economies and transitions. But to your point, I think what we need are more examples that tends to have an inspiring effect. And perhaps that's coming back to the idea of these kinds of knowledge-sharing platforms like the ones we're participating in now, to be able to share that knowledge and hopefully cross-fertilize once those impacts really become more prominent.
Just to say, whenever the shock hits and the social protection system is there, as the example that Zara gave with Pakistan, the countries use it. So perhaps they don't have a specific strategy of shining documents, but whenever the necessity comes, if they have the instrument, they are going to use the social protection to respond to that specific climate shock. We have seen that on droughts, we have seen that on floods. As Zara said, people flex. We need to do something, we have this, we are going to reply this way. In terms of the advocacy, if you look, for example, at the call to action now from South Africa, we can see pretty clear, and we can see through the G20 declarations on how adaptive social protection became the language. So it's flexible. It's not only about climate. It also refers to other type of crisis, and how the social protection instruments that are part of these systems. So we see now this push to have on the national determined contributions or the national adaptation plans clearly stating the role of social protection, both on building resilience and helping adaptation, and also responding to the crisis. We also see that, most of the vertical environmental climate funds, they are not still used to this language, but they are starting talking about it. And we can see some of initiatives like the Adaptive Social Protection and Climate Finance Task Force that was built around the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, how they are bringing together the vertical climate and environmental funds also to discuss social protection instruments.
Zara, speaking of crisis, we ran a series earlier this year on social protection and conflict and protracted crisis. And as we look on the past decade, we should perhaps also mention the humanitarian development peace nexus, the triple nexus, which I believe first came to prominence in 2016 in the World Humanitarian Summit, although, of course, these ideas have been around for some time. There are plenty of parallels and intersections between the increasing use of cash assistance in emergencies with the growth of social protection cash transfers. What has changed, do you think, in the way that crises are responded to and the way social protection is intersecting with that humanitarian effort?
Right. When we're talking about a response, one of the first questions that now humanitarians do finally ask is, are we using the system? Yes or no? And how are we using the system? Can we link to the system? I think there still isn't enough of an understanding of what a national social protection actually is, how it functions, what it looks like. Can we maintain the routine social protection functions first before we start just piling everything onto it? But at least it is one of the first questions that is now asked. The SPIACB group on linking social protection and cash has come up with these great principles, and they're called the common principles. It's brilliant. It's got monitoring and evaluation. They're talking about joint assessments. They're talking about what does neutrality have to look like? How do you bring local populations in? What does communication need to look like? What does grievance response mechanisms need to look like? So there's a lot there. They also have this how-to guide in terms of how they can operationalize some of these things. I think it's been really, really interesting to get some real examples of how international humanitarian actors and social protection actors have actually been working together. It's been brilliant to see. And Ed and I somehow managed to work on this a little bit together. I was looking at the RDNA, so the Recovery Disaster Needs Assessment that the World Bank, UN agencies, and the EU do together. And we were looking at this in Palestine. This was last November. There was a social protection chapter that was being written up and done. And one of the things that we did over there that normally does not happen is we made sure that the cash working group was very much involved. This is a document that normally international humanitarian actors are not very involved in. We made sure that that was happening because I think this bridging needs to be absolutely happening because it makes programs better. It makes the response better altogether.
Fabio, social protection is back in the spotlight for the G20 and in the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, which came out of Brazil's G20 presidency last year. How did that come about?
Social protection, at least within the development working group, and I would also say the employment working group, has been always very present in all the declarations and some of the knowledge products commissioned by the G20. The Alliance tried to put the SDG 1 and 2 instruments together, so there was this close link And if we look at the foundational documents, this close rationale on how social protection is good to reduce poverty, to achieve these SDG 1.3, these precise targets, but also contributes to food security and nutrition. And the foundation documents use lots of the evidence that has been produced by several international organizations and by several country experience. It also mentions this contribution to the other dimensions, particularly to gender equality, to decent work, and also to reduction into inequality. That was the overall priority from G20 Brazil. So when we finish the first rounds of countries having the presence of social protection, we have this connection between the beginning in 2010, where social protection was seen as a key action for growth with resilience. And now we see this call to action, all the knowledge and all the experience coming together. And to mention the socialprotection.org, we have a clear statement of the importance of knowledge sharing, the role that socialprotection.org, ISPAC-B, USP 2030 have on bringing together knowledge and facilitating peer-to-peer learning across countries to develop social protection systems.
I wanted to end with a question for all of you. How do you think we'll be talking about social protection over the next 5 years? And how do you see the role of platforms like socialprotection.org in those developments to come? Zara, can I start with you?
I'm going to answer the same way in which I live and conduct myself, and I'm going to do this in a future that I hope it is. Right, the ways in which Zohran Mamdani, actually the potential mayor of New York, is talking about it in terms of affordability. And I really, really love that, because I think we use it and we say social protection, but how do we translate that to make people care about what social protection actually is? The layperson, the person for whom these programs actually are. You know, this language of affordability and saying we need universal childcare, we need free groceries, we need free buses. And I really want to see us in a position where we're talking about social protection in this way. What does this mean in my life? How do I do it? We have, normal citizens really sitting behind social protection and demanding their rights around this. I think the role of sp.org needs to continue as is. It's not a very sexy answer, but in terms of building community, taking our ideas, being able to implement them for us, it's an incredibly valuable service that you bring to the community. And thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
As with Zara, I'm going to say what I hope. And I hope we'll be talking more about the political economy of social protection, and including in relation to shocks. And while less global financing might be a key driver of a greater focus on politics, I also hope that implementers realize that understanding political economy, responding to political economy will also deliver the most bang for buck. I think about this in two ways. First, having a better understanding of or recognition of the domestic politics of social protection. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think part of it means meeting national elites where they are, working with them on their priorities that they identify. And on the international side, the second dimension, and perhaps this also is where socialprotection.org could come in and expand its very valuable work, and helping the international community perhaps be a lot more honest about the systemic incentives that exist at individual and organizational levels, and acknowledging that we might all have good intentions. We want the best for the poorest and most vulnerable people, but also acknowledging these systemic factors that incentivize us to act in a way that preserves the status quo. So I'd like to think that there's safe spaces for people to be able to do that. Thanks for having me, Joe. It's been great to be on the podcast. Fabulous to be chatting with you all.
And Fabio, your thoughts? Where will we be in 5 years?
Well, in 5 years, we'll be taking stock of what happened with the SDGs. We'll be looking at how much we were able to expand social protection coverage, on how efficient the instruments have been, on how it has contributed to the other SDGs. And I do see a key role for the socialprotection.org in helping us in this reflection and on the debate on how social protection will adapt to the new challenges of the future. I also think that we can have more government officials and practitioners from the countries taking the lead in some of these discussions. And then to link with what Ed said, perhaps then we can have a more candid discussion around these issues, because they are the ones that actually are facing the challenges. And we finally finish this whole discussion that social protection generates dependence that we know very well, that pushes back many countries and many people, many key people that could be leading this process, that they fear that this is just a waste of money. We have lots of evidence to show that it's not a waste of money. We can improve it, of course we can, but the way forward is actually to make sure that it's there, existing for all. It doesn't need to be the same in every country, but the important thing is that when you have a need, you have a social protection program or a social protection system to support you, to be resilient in kickback. And thank you for having me. Thank you, Zara. Thank you, Ed, for the discussion. It's always lovely to hear from you.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. And of course, it's a big event for us this month with the 10th anniversary of socialprotection.org platform. So joining us for Quick Wins today is Mariana Balboni. Mariana is the coordinator of the socialprotection.org platform, and she's been part of the story from almost the very beginning. Welcome, Mariana.
Hello, Joe. Really nice to be here with you.
So, Mari, we're celebrating 10 years of socialprotection.org. Looking back over those last 10 years, what are some of the moments or achievements that stand out for you in socialprotection.org's journey?
Well, Joe, there's so many moments, but when I think about our journey over the past decade, I see it as a story of strong collective effort and constant evolution. Our team is always adapting to meet the needs of the social protection sector. And one of the most defining moments for me was definitely our response to COVID-19, when we mobilized the Social Protection Task Force and created real-time spaces for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to exchange knowledge. Between March and September 2020, we organized 32 webinars spotlighting global experiences and best practices. And we launched a weekly newsletter that curated thousands of materials on country responses. And the results were incredible. Our webinar attendance jumped from about 100 people to nearly 500 attendees. All this, it's important to mention, was developed in close collaboration with IBCIG, GIZ, DFAT, and many other partners. And to wrap up this intense period, we hosted the Global E-Conference, turning the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity. It was our biggest achievement yet, definitely. It brought people together from around the world for 3 days in 3 different time zones to take stock of lessons learned, exchange knowledge, and imagine the future of social protection in a post-pandemic world. It was also a celebration of socialprotection.org's first 5 years and a reminder of what we can achieve together. Beyond COVID-19, I'm proud of our contribution to major global initiatives, such as the G20 Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, for example. We partnered with the Brazilian Ministry of Social Development and IPEA to support the implementation of the alliance. Our contribution went from curating its policy basket, compiling evidence-based and adaptable policy tools in collaboration with experts and governments, to creating the Alliance's visual identity, developing its official website, and managing its digital presence across social media. Through these efforts, we strengthened international cooperation, expanded the Alliance's visibility, and reinforced its credibility as a global platform for action. So, collaborating with the G20 Brazilian presidency was very important to us. It is also important to mention our continued support to foster and disseminate important multi-agency social protection global and collaborative initiatives like the USP 2030 and the SPIEC-B. And we have been supporting many global events and initiatives like the Asia Pacific Social Protection Week in Manila and the Global Forum on Adaptive Social Protection in Berlin, those in 2023. And I'd like also to mention our long-lasting partnership with Transform, the innovative capacity building initiative to implement national social protection systems in Africa and also now in the Arab region. Community building has also been a big part of our story. Our annual ambassadors program, for example, has trained more than 300 volunteers from nearly 100 countries to keep content up to date, advocate for social protection, and increase its visibility worldwide. And of course, there's the rich body of content we've built together. More than 30 courses, over 360 webinars, and of course, producing our own podcast. These aren't just numbers or activities. They are moments when we've brought together people. We've fostered new collaboration and turned knowledge into action. And honestly, there are so many, I could just keep on going, so I'll just stop here.
It's tricky asking you, I know, for a couple of standout highlights because there are so many to look back on. And the journey's not over, of course. In our last interview, we looked ahead to what the developments in the sector might be. Can I ask you to look ahead and tell us about the priorities for socialprotection.org in the next decade?
There's so much we would like to do, but our focus is on strengthening our role as a truly global hub for social protection knowledge and collaboration. We want to continue innovating in how knowledge is produced and shared, expanding our learning offer, developing new interactive formats for exchanging and disseminating knowledge, and making sure that our content is accessible and relevant to diverse audiences. And this includes especially providing policymakers with timely, evidence-based resources to support better informed decisions and improve program design. And second, we are developing a new and more collaborative version of the platform, and it's one that will make it even easier for members to connect, co-create, and exchange knowledge in real time. I'm looking forward to releasing it soon. And thirdly, I would highlight that we will be exploring the potential of artificial intelligence to help us curate, analyze, and deliver knowledge in smarter, more personalized ways, while keeping the human expertise and relationships that make our community unique. And of course, we will keep strengthening our partnerships because everything we do is built on collaboration. That means working even more closely with governments, international organizations, academia, and civil society to bridge knowledge gaps and ensure evidence is translated into better policy and programs. We will also be focusing on the big challenges ahead: climate change, demographic shifts, inequality, and economic volatility. Social protection will have to adapt and respond to these realities, and we want to be at the forefront of those conversations, making sure that our community has the tools and connections it needs.
Fantastic. And I'm particularly looking forward to the new iteration of the platform to support even more of that collaboration, as you were saying, Mari. So to wrap up, can you give me one message to our members and partners and listeners as we enter the next decade?
Well, my message would be simple. This platform is yours. Everything we've achieved over the past 10 years has been thanks to the thousands of members, partners, and collaborators who share their knowledge, time, and passion into the platform. And as we enter our second decade, I invite you to keep contributing, engaging, and challenging us to do better. Because when we work together across countries, disciplines, and perspectives, we don't just exchange ideas. We shape the future of social protection, making it more inclusive, adequate, comprehensive, and sustainable for everyone.
That's such a great message that this platform, belongs to the users. I've said this before on the podcast, but I was a big fan and a user of socialprotection.org long before I became host of the podcast. And I still use the resources all the time in my own work and practice. So I'm very grateful to see the platform enter into this next decade. Mariana Balboni, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection podcast today.
Hi, Joe. It was really a pleasure being with you today and with the audience. And thank you for participating in our platform and looking forward to the next 10 years.
So thank you again for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by, you guessed it, socialprotection.org. Happy anniversary, team. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.